everybody, it's Jason from Murideo. Thank you so much for coming to hang out today. I have a very special guest, my friend Mike from Toronto. Hello, Mike.
Hello, Jason. Good to see you.
You too. So we wanted to get together today to talk about, it's a question I get often, so I figured let's talk about it. People learn how to calibrate flat panels typically first, and then they come and say, okay, how do we do projectors? And it's always this conversation of, well, it's basically the same, the fundamentals are the same, but there's all these extra things you have to kind of worry about, where to put the meter and just, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought it'd be fun if you and I got together and sort of talked about it. You do a lot of projectors, it seems like.
Yeah, I do. It seems to be definitely a mix of panel and projectors, but as the home theater market has really exploded, especially post, COVID pandemic, a lot more people are starting to redesign their theaters again in their basements, right, and seeing a big sale on projectors from the companies, the stores around me, and getting calls for projectors far more.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm seeing about, like, me personally, I've done a lot of projectors lately, but it seems to be, if I average it out, probably like half and half with flat panels. But, when you go into a dedicated theater room with a projector, there's just, man, there's so many other things to worry about. Light output is always a big one. And we can talk about, screens being too big and rooms not being dark enough and stuff like that. Before I get too deep, though, I do want to mention to everybody, if you're listening or watching live, there's a chat box. So if you have any questions specifically, go ahead and type them into that chat box, and we'll be sure to get to them. So before we get too deep, I've known you for quite a while. Could you just give everybody sort of an intro on who you are and where you've been and what you got going on?
Sure, sounds great. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar here. My name is Mike. My website's videocalibrations.ca. I am an ISF THX calibrator in Canada. I'm located in the GTA, Toronto area, but I service Ontario and Quebec, so Montreal area. I started calibrating back in 1999 and got officially certified in 2001, so going back some time ago. So over the 20 years, I've seen, I started on CRTs and now all the way up to these wonderful, awesome HDR displays. And my work is for both residential and a lot of the post-production community here in Toronto, Montreal, visual effects companies, colorists, where I calibrate their displays to bring you the awesome content that we watch on UHD Blu-ray and streaming sites. So Netflix is definitely a big part of my clientele's work.
It seems like Toronto has been lately sort of a hotbed, if you will, of production. Kind of like here in the States, Atlanta, Georgia has all of a sudden become like a big hotspot for filming. And I think it's because maybe the taxes are a little bit different. So a lot of people are coming from California to shoot in Georgia. But it also seems like Toronto is a pretty hopping place too.
Yeah, Toronto for sure, and Montreal. It's funny because actually some of the companies up here have offices in Atlanta as well. So
see, there you go.
There's connections there, right? And they're Toronto-based companies. But definitely there are some big productions that are constantly being done here, and a lot of the VFX work and colors, the finishing of the films are being done in Toronto. So there's a lot of major works that's been done and of the content that we enjoy today. So I'm just happy being part of the process to calibrate the displays for all these colorists because, they have filmmakers that are sitting right behind them when they're looking at the content, and they got to make sure that their stuff is perfect. So part of our jobs, Jason, as calibrators, to make sure that that the studio monitors are calibrated perfectly, as well as home TV sets, right? So this way everybody sees the exact same content the way it was intended to.
Yeah, and that's so cool that you mentioned that because again, when we talk about projectors, the fundamentals are exactly the same. We're still aiming for a specific white point, a specific color gamut, but just the way you approach it has to be a little bit different. So what I also see in a lot of cases is you'll have like a screening room. Like we have a mutual friend who works in a studio, and they have a screening room with a JVC projector, but they also have some LG OLEDs and some other like reference monitors too. But at the end of the day, we're still trying to achieve the same thing. We want the content to look as close to the director's and cinematographer's intent as possible. So there's really nothing new when you start talking about that.
Yeah, with SDR, I mean, with standard dynamic range HD, I'll probably refer to HD as SDR because that's sort of the terminology I kind of say for short with people. 1080p.
Sure.
We're still aiming for D65 as our white point, 313329. and 2.4 gamma. 100 nits is our reference white in the studio, and that's the aim. So whether we're watching it on a reference monitor, a Sony BVM or a PVM, or a consumer display or a projector, we want to make sure that we're maintaining those standards, because the films that we watch in standard dynamic range is colored to that. And the artistic intent is designed to stick within those parameters. So at home, if we want to stay within that realm, we have to achieve those same targets. Now, of course, as we know, when we move to flat panels in a living room environment, we do bring the white point up a little bit higher. We extend that a bit just to compete with the average light that may be in the room from the ceiling or from the windows. But for the most part, we stay within that. And HDR, of course, has its own set of standards, which, of course, we could talk throughout this webinar.
Cool. So let's get into it. Also, there was a comment that somebody mentioned already that your mic was a little hot. So, yeah, I don't know if there's anything we can do about it. Maybe, like, I don't want to say talk quieter, but maybe.
Yeah. If I talk at a little lower volume, does that help out? This way,
yeah. If you guys are hearing that, it sounds a little bit better. Just let me know. And
okay, I have a microphone meter over here, but it doesn't show it peaking. But if I'll talk at a lower volume level, if this helps.
Yeah, that's okay. He just said that it is sounding a lot better, so we'll just go with that. So cool, thanks for that. So let's start simple, man. When you show up to a job site and you know it's going to be let's just say a dedicated theater, because that's the most common. What are some things that you personally are looking for when you're sort of I like to sort of analyze the room first and get a good idea of how dark it is and how big the screen is. And I do a lot of this stuff before I even take my gear out. My laptop and everything's still in my backpack. So I'm looking at screen size, screen material, whether it's acoustically transparent or not, whether they have overhead lights or not, where they sit, distance-wise. By the time you get to the job site, I hope most calibrators already know what projector it is. So you might already have some ideas looking around the room what you might do to that projector to make it shine in the room. So what are some of the things you look for when you're sort of entering a job like that?
And I think all those points that you say are great things, and I'll actually say, from my experience in the past as a firefighter, we called something which is called size up the scene, and it's prior to arriving on site. You have to sort of manage your expectations about what you could possibly encounter when you're there. So when you book the client, what you ask those questions is just saying what projector, what screen size. So prior to arriving on scene, you sort of already have an idea of what method you're going to take when you're going to calibrate this projector. And also in the conversation with the client over phone or over email, you also sort of manage their expectations. So when I'm walking into the room, when you see that space, yes, right away I'll take a look to see how close is the ceiling to the wall, to the top of the screen, how tight is the room. And then the first thing I usually look at is the projector. Has the projector been mounted correctly? Because that's also going to make a big difference in terms of the setup. And this is not to slight anybody at all, because I think that you have a variety of different installers, or maybe the client themselves, the owner of the projector, maybe put it up, and they may not realize, hey, this projector actually has to stay level. And there's often some times where I'll go into a job and I'll see the projector's been mounted facing downwards at the screen, and it's easy to think that way because the projector's up high, you're aiming down, so they might think that that's the best way to do it. But as you and I know, that once you start doing that, then you have to apply digital keystone, and digital keystone will reduce resolution quite significantly. So going in right away, I think I bring a kit with me. I've got a level on there. You got a tape measure, and occasionally be prepared to do a little bit of mount work on it just to set the projector straight. If it's a mount that I'm comfortable dealing with, because some of them are very tricky, and the last thing you want is the projector to come down on you if you're not familiar with the mount, right?
Yeah. I had a calibration I did last week for a dealer down in South Florida, and just because of the way the room was built, the projector was in sort of its own little cubby hole in the back of the room, of course, and it was kind of high, and there was no way to put the new projector any lower. So the installation team on that job just had to use keystone, or it just wasn't. There was literally no other option. But the point of this is, if there is an option and there is an opportunity to put the projector in the right place, definitely do that. And there's been plenty of times where I've run to Home Depot before and had them make a pole for me that's threaded so I can move the projector further down from the ceiling. But my sort of rule of thumb, and maybe this is yours too, but I typically want the lens to be in the middle of the screen, of course. So let's just say the middle of the screen here. And I also don't want the lens to be above the top of the screen. So I try to get the lens dead center and just maybe a tiny bit below the top of the screen. But that's usually what I go for. Is that something you're looking at too?
Yeah, and I don't often manipulate the installation too much. So
Right.
if I have a chance to work with the installation team prior to the projector being put up there, then yes, you would definitely, for anybody who's considering putting a system together, definitely a lens in the center of the screen. The less shifting that we have to do within the lens, the better off
Right.
our image is going to be. Because if you have the projector that's set this far, then you have to turn the image this direction. As you know, you will have a bit of a misalignment of focus. So when you start focusing the projector, then you get said, okay, well, it's super sharp on this side.
Oh yeah.
Not quite sharp on that side because of the lens difference. So staying in the center as much as possible. And when I get to a job, you can start off by saying, okay, I can do a lens center automatically on a projector because we know we're going to be setting the lens differently anyway.
Right.
So where is lens center? Where is this projector sitting based on that? And if we have the ability to move it physically, as I always tell people, any kind of analog adjustment first, physical or up, down with the lens is always the best adjustment versus manipulating the picture digitally.
Yeah, there was a comment from a mutual friend of ours, Mr. Chen. He mentioned that you don't really want to get involved. You're not there to reinstall the projector. It might be a good way of saying it, but I'm a huge fan of. There's been a lot of jobs I show up to where I'm like, man, I wish I'd just been a little more involved on the front end. We could have done this a little bit differently or done that a little bit differently. But Michael's exactly right. Like, you're not there to reinstall the projector, but hopefully it's just some minor adjustments that you can do with just some basic tools. Maybe a hex key set because the mount might take those. A couple of screwdrivers, a level, and I like to use a laser pointer too. Just so even if it's a really simple like pen laser pointer that you can buy anywhere, that way you can put it in the center of the projector and make sure you're dead center with the screen. So in all these things that we're talking about right now, you do not have to worry about with a flat panel. So in this case, it's just a matter of keeping some extra tools with you, and maybe hopping up on the ladder and making sure everything's okay. But if the projector is installed well, you don't need to do any of that. You pull up a test pattern and you go, boom, this is already done.
And I think that's when you say it's already installed well, I think as a calibrator, it's good to establish some good relationships with your dealers in your local area where you can have those conversations in advance. And by all means, I find that the majority of them are very open to having those discussions because they may not necessarily know, and it makes their installations better so that when their clients get to enjoy the picture quality, they know that they're already partway there with the installation and we don't have to call anybody back, right?
Right. Yeah. That's a good point too. Like, if you have a really good relationship with the dealers, and just I do a lot of training, and these guys, they want to learn and they want to make sure they're doing it right. So if you kind of show them a few things, even if it's just throwing up a multi-burst pattern to look at the keystone, you can say, look, this is, this test pattern looks wrecked because we had to use keystone. Here's how we could do that a little bit better next time. And most integrators that I work with personally, they love that stuff because, some of these guys maybe have never seen a test pattern like that before, so they never knew how detrimental it was to the picture. So I love that you do that. And it's nice too, because if I work with a dealer enough times, by the time we have this relationship established and we've taught them a few things along the way, you start showing up to jobs where they've taken your feedback and everything's right off the bat. So you're not having to climb a ladder and bring out your level and do all that kind of stuff. Where it gets
to avoid those things, right? And I just want to let the viewership know, if anybody's listening, that I'm actually not a store. I'm not actually a dealer. I work with dealers in the area, so that's where I'm talking about having a relationship with dealers. If you're a freelance calibrator, or just if you're here to just enjoy how to set up your own projector, that's where I'm coming from. Is just making sure that these things are done in advance.
The other thing that I run into a lot are do-it-yourselfers, which I love because if you know, and I mean, if you do enough reading on the internet and watch enough videos, there's so much information out there about how to do this in a very good way. So I get some do-it-yourselfers who really understand it, and they do get the projector in the right place. But then there's other do-it-yourselfers I run into where, you know, they just threw the projector wherever it would fit because maybe it's a living room and the room's not that deep, and you know, they're keystoning and they're not level and stuff like that. But I find it very valuable to teach people, not just get up on the ladder and do it, to show them actually why they should do it a certain way.
It's always important, and when I have my clients with me, a lot of people are usually interested to see the process, and showing them really gives them a better understanding about where it was before and where it is afterwards. So, you know, once the projector is all set up and it's aligned properly, and if we have no keystone on it, this is where we can move into the next set of adjustments, which would be working on the zoom, the shifting, and the focusing. Most screens, as we know, have some sort of border around the edges, and it's always good to have just a slight bit of overscan, because unless we get everything 100% mathematically perfect from the center of the lens to 100% straight to the screen being flush on the wall, not having any shift, there's always going to be a little bit. I think that the realistic thing to tell our viewers is that there's always going to be a little bit of overscan somewhere at some point on the screen, and it's okay to see that on a test pattern, because with real content we're not really going to notice any of that at all, and if anything's major, there's a blanking control. But setting it up, you know, in terms of that, to make sure that we're aligned properly, will give us the least amount of distortion on the screen, the maximum amount of information shown on the viewable section of the screen.
Yeah. And then probably just like you and many others that we know, this is before I even take out my light meter. You know, I want to make sure the screen and the projector are aligned to each other before I do anything. So do you do that kind of stuff first as well?
Yeah. So I'll open up. I got a couple of different kits. I got a case with a meter. I've got a case full of cables and extension cords, and then I got my projector bag that I bring with my tools. So occasionally I'll bring a step ladder. You know, it's in my car or something. But yes, exactly. So before I crack out all the meters, because the reality is you don't want your wiring to be all around the room when you're kind of bouncing around front to back, and you know you got a client that's in there too. So if you're working on the alignment, your tools are out. It's best to keep the valuable things kind of packed in their boxes before pulling it out. With the exception, of course, the pattern generator, which we'd have out, and if you need to plug in directly into the projector, because some of the cabling is done through the ceilings. So you know, if you don't have a long enough HDMI fiber cable to go to another room where there's an equipment rack, you'll want to go directly into the projector, into the back. Yeah. And I guess the only challenge with that is sometimes you probably come across it. Some of the mounts aren't exactly sturdy, so they bounce the projector up and down when when you're plugging stuff in. So it's like, can I surgically put the HDMI cable in without moving the nice leveling that I've done, and then going back from there?
Yeah, the other thing I also always tell people, it's really important. I mean, let's be real here. You can buy a $30 mount off Amazon for a flat panel, and it's usually going to be totally fine and easy to work with. But projector mounts, if they have any play in them at all, the mount might shake the projector when the base hits. Yeah. And then now you're having to realign and. Oh yeah, they're walking on the top floor. Yeah.
And you see the kids are running up there, and the whole screen's moving.
Yeah, good point. So topic number one, or section number one, I'll say, is we've got to make sure before we do anything that the projector's aligned correctly. And if it's not, you just kind of have to do your best with what you have to work with. But after alignment, and again, this is nothing to worry about with flat panels at all. This is a strict projector thing. The other thing we have to take into consideration too is the convergence on the projector.
Some, as you know, you've probably come across a few where the convergence has been pretty good. And then there's been the odd projector where it's way off. Like, it's not even close. And the telltale sign, obviously, is when you put up a user menu. The alignment is just not even there. So yeah, working a little bit on it, and you know what? Usually with projectors, they'll give you a coarse adjustment, so something that will shift everything. Your green always stays stable, and then you can move red or blue over top of that, and try to find your best match in the vertical and the horizontal direction. Yeah. And then from there, if we need to go to a fine control, then for our viewers who may not know what convergence is to make sure that the red, green, and the blue are all aligned on top of each other in order to make white. And that's the goal. So we can turn off certain colors. You know, we can turn off either red or we can turn off blue. So you can see red on green, or you can see green on blue. And from there, we're able to see how much is off. Now, I always flip back and forth between that and a resolution pattern, because you do want to take a look to see what happens to the resolution, because there have been a few pieces, and they're not coming to my mind, where if you be a bit too aggressive on the manipulating the convergence in these digital projectors, that you can harm resolution. So it's sort of becoming one of those things where you have to kind of pick the best between the two. It's like, if the convergence is severely off, is that worse than possible slight loss in 4K resolution with a 4K pattern? And then, which in my answer to that is yes, you want to make sure that it's converged at least fairly tightly. And this is going back to the days of CRT as well, right?
I know, to your point you brought up before, I am seeing most of the common brand projectors nowadays are coming out of the box pretty well converged, and some of them you can not only converge in the center, but you can also converge different zones too. But where that gets tricky is the wall flat that the screen is on, because a lot of times you might get the convergence like bang on in the middle, but it's a little off, like maybe in the corners. So, you know, is the screen perfectly flat? Is the projector aligned? All these things have to be taken into consideration, again, before you even take out your light meters in your laptop and your software. Typically, you know, if I'm in a situation where I can't quite get the convergence right, maybe in the corners or the middle or the corners at the bottom, I'm typically just gonna, if I can't get everything right, then I'm definitely aiming for the middle crosshatches on that internal test pattern in the projector. So you know, the middle is always going to be the best place to start, I feel like. And then if you have good enough controls to do the corners and do the edges and whatnot, then that's pretty fun too. And I don't know about you, but I mean, just to bring up that test pattern inside the menu of the projector, and at least get the middle aligned, I mean, you're talking 5 minutes maybe.
Yeah, it's a fairly quick process, and it's more of the fine convergence, as you know, when you're starting to go around in the zones all around the screen. That's what could take a little bit longer. And I don't often get that far into it, except for I'll say one of my visual effects studios that I do work for, who has a VPL VW 270 projector, the consumer version of the pro version of the RS5, or is it 5000? Sorry.
The 5000 ES. Yeah.
Large one. So they had a shot where they had a space scene, and you could see all the little stars, but they were seeing, you know, red and blue off, so they didn't know what it was. So one of the easiest ways is that not only could you put up an external grid pattern, but in your pattern generator, you also have dots, very fine dots. So you can align and use the image on the screen to help with that alignment as well. But I think another issue with convergence as well, and we won't get too deep into this, I don't think, is it really helps though if you have an anamorphic lens. So as you know, with along the edges, that's where you tend to get that color fray, and that can help. The convergence control can help bring that in if it's a fixed anamorphic lens in front of the projector.
Yeah, and the other thing I want to mention for people who might not do projectors often, or maybe they haven't done one before, projectors typically do have internal test patterns for some of these things. And sometimes if you want to, you can certainly use your test pattern generator to look at some of your own test patterns. They also have built-in test patterns usually for focus and zoom and things like that. But just one thing to remember, if you're going to use test patterns from a generator or maybe a Blu-ray disc with Spears and Munsell or something like that, don't forget you will have to go into the projector's menu and turn off the internal test patterns. I've had people before, and they hit the convergence menu, and they're waiting for their test pattern to be on the screen, and they're seeing a test pattern they've never seen before. That's the internal test pattern of the projector. So if you want external, just make sure you turn it off. That's all, super easy.
That's right. Yeah. And you also have to be concerned about with the internal test patterns for those who may be considering getting a projector, that some of the projectors have 4096 as a horizontal resolution. So if you align it using the internal test pattern, your image is going to be much smaller on the screen because you're using the outside of the projector. I've come across a couple of situations where the clients, like, they're scratching their head. I'm like, I've set it up and I've used the internal patterns, but I always get these bars on the top and the bottom. I'm like, that's because it's a 4096 panel. We need to do it with 3840.
Exactly. No, good point. Good point. So I think the next thing we should talk about, and if anybody has any questions about alignment and convergence, go ahead and throw it into the chat box there. I think the next thing to talk about, yeah, this is the question I get most common. Hey, I'm doing my first projector. Where do I put my meter? I have no idea. So maybe let's talk about meter placement a little bit. The number one thing I tell people is you don't want your meter to cast a shadow onto the screen and the lens of the meter is aiming at that shadow. So a lot of times I'll leave my tripod maybe slightly low and just angle the meter up just like a tiny bit. And it really helps if you have a light meter, like let's just say a Klein K10 as an example, that has a laser target. So you can have the meter kind of wherever you want, if you will, and you can have maybe a 10% test pattern on the screen and use the laser pointer that's built into the meter and make sure that that laser target is in the window and not outside of the window or not in the shadow of the meter. And I find that super helpful to use the internals. But then some people will have like a really good budget meter, like let's just say the Portrait Displays C6 HDR 2000. Obviously no internal laser target on that one, but you already have your laser pointer because you got it to align the projector. Maybe use that laser pointer to make sure, yeah, you probably have to hold it up to the meter. Maybe if you want to get real fancy, maybe you tape it to the meter. But that might be another good way of aiming in the right spot of the screen. What do you like to do?
Well, and I'll just bounce off that since we're talking about it. And for people with like a C6, let's not forget that inside CalMan there is a meter function. So wherever you plan on putting the meter, you could have it constantly running, and you can move it if it's on a tripod, left or right, up and down, and just keep an eye on your luminance value and look for where it's the strongest. And at that point, that's where you get the strongest amount of light. So for people with meters like that. And mine has I have a viewfinder, so I can look through it and I can see where I'm aiming it. But meter placement is very, very important. And I think it's even more important if we're dealing with screens that are different than a 1.0 gain screen. If we're Unity gain, depending on where our angles are, you can pretty much be sitting anywhere and you can aim it and I'm going to get a very similar measurement. But if we're dealing with high gain screens, then I think it's also important to aim that meter in the direction of the site where the majority of people are going to be sitting. So with the way I do things, I keep my meter back a little bit further. So if you keep your meter up too close to the screen, say if this is a screen right here and you want to, there we go. And if you put your meter like right up next to the screen and you have it on a severe angle like that, trying to catch the light, because I've seen people do that. Well, if you have a screen that's of a high gain or say a dark base screen, the way the light is seen at that level is going to be extremely different than looking back here like that. So it's going to really give errors in the reading. So my preference is to keep it back, keep the meter back. I'm several feet back, and sometimes I'm 10 feet back from the screen, and I'm right where I'm looking through my lens. I'm right up to where the eye point is looking at the screen. So that is a preference, but I think it's a bit meter dependent. I think you need to know the strengths and the weaknesses of the meter that you are using, and try the aim meter function, see where you're getting the best amount of light, and try to stay within the viewing angle of the person's eyes to the screen. Right. If we're dealing with a high gain or a negative gain screen, or a black gain screen.
I love your point you made about if it is a meter that doesn't have a laser pointer. Watching your luminance values like in a continuous read mode, and as soon as you get that, the highest value, then that's where it goes. And for anybody who's done any pro audio or live performances, like when you have a microphone, a typical microphone like a Shure SM58 or something, when you're doing sound check, you're taking the microphone and you're going like this, and oh my gosh, it's nice and loud here, and it's not so loud here, and it's nice and loud right here, so you know exactly where it's supposed to go. I think that's usually what I tell people if they don't have a laser pointer. But your point about having it 10 feet away, another question I get all the time too is, am I going to get the same reading if I'm 1 foot away versus 10 feet away? So what's your experience in that regard?
My experience with my meter, I don't get any difference in reading. And with an i1 Pro 2, another one of the meters that I have, which is more my general meters, I don't get a difference of reading as well, as long as it's aimed correctly. And that's a meter that's a bit tricky to set up, because on the tripod you can you can turn it this way just ever so slightly, and I'll lose about 5 nits. I'm like, okay, aim it back that way. So as long as you have that, that's okay. It's got to be aimed at the right spot. Is there a distance that's too far back? Very likely. Again, I haven't experimented with, like, what is the maximum of that particular meter, but it's just, again, knowing that meter, and I would encourage people to experiment with it. Okay, what happens when I'm 5 feet back? Because again, I want to try to avoid getting too close to the screen, because then you start dealing with shadows, and you got to increase the angle just to get past your shadow, and that could be a problem. So bring it back, give it a try. Try 8 feet back. To those viewers who are here, if you have a meter that's like an i1 Pro 2 or a C6, and see what you get. And don't compare it though to one that's like right under the screen, because that could be, that's probably more the one with the error.
We were doing some experimenting. I was in Orlando with my friend Bruce, who's listening. Hi, Bruce. And they do live production with giant LED walls. And we were in their warehouse, which had fluorescent lights and all this other stuff. But when we were taking readings, really close to, I mean, those are self-emissive, so you don't have to worry about angles and stuff. But we were taking readings, 6 inches from the screen, 6 feet back from the screen, 10 feet back from the screen, and we weren't seeing any difference in the numbers. The other thing I want to touch on too is if you have some high-end meters and you're, I'll just use the Klein and Jetty combo as an example, because that's what I have right now. The laser sight for the Jetty is much smaller than the Klein if they're at the same position. So what I have to do sometimes when I'm making my profile for the Klein, I'll put the Jetty on a second tripod back a little bit further, and then fire up the laser pointers on both meters, and I'll move the Jetty forwards or backwards until its laser sight is the same size and in the same place as the Klein's laser sight. And I don't know if that's maybe just kind of going over the top a little bit, but at least I have the peace of mind that I'm reading the exact same spot on the screen with both meters.
We're videophiles. We like to get down to the nth degree, so I don't think anything's over the top. If it makes us comfortable and we know that we're going to get perfect for our clients, or I would say near to perfect, that's perfectly okay.
Yeah, and the other thing you got to keep in mind too is if you do have a high gain screen, and looking at it from different angles and stuff, you'll see it sort of sparkle. You'll see some hot spots. If your meter's really far back and you're aiming at this giant target, you're going to have inconsistencies within your target that you're aiming your meter at. So you have to find this balance between, how big do I want my patch that I'm going to use, my test pattern? How big is the laser target? Do I need to move it a little bit closer? Because the last thing you want to do is start chasing your tail when you're calibrating and you're getting inconsistent readings and the meter's in the same spot. Maybe go down to a 10% window or something and move the meter a little closer. You might get more consistent results. Is that something you run into as well?
Yeah, and I mean, because I don't have experience with a wide range of meters out there, because mine has a bit of a zoom lens on it, so it always focuses on a very, very fine spot. If I pull back a meter, I'm not sure how much light that meter is going to be capturing across the whole of the screen. But what you're telling me is making sense here, because yes, as you're dealing with a high gain screen, I don't know how many of those are out there in the home theaters, anything higher than 1.5. Yes, that shift really does happen. Stay focused towards the center, do your very best is what I would recommend to people, and just use the meter level. I'm losing my mind here for a second.
It's okay.
the reading, a meter function, yes.
The other thing I try to think about too is I feel like it saves me a little bit of time, and I'm able to do a little more verification as I'm going or at the end. I have a second tripod because, if I want to switch between meters inside the software, then I can switch between the 2 meters and just do some verifications. So if I profile the Klein and take a bunch of readings, and I take those same readings with the Jetty, I want them still in the same spot on the screen. What I don't want to do is take the Klein off the tripod and then put the Jetty on the tripod. For the amount of money a second tripod costs, I just like setting up 2 tripods.
Yeah, it makes sense. So it streamlines your service a bit more. It's less monkeying around. It's at least you maintain your accuracy, having both aimed at the same spot all the time.
Right.
You don't have to worry about setting it back up again. So I agree with you entirely.
Yeah, cool. So we talked about getting the projector in the right spot and getting the alignment done. We talked about where you put your meters. The next thing I want to talk about, and you just posted something about this on your Instagram, the room lighting. So with projection, it is unbelievably important to murder all of the light in the room as much as you can. And here's a really easy example. I was watching a movie in the theater pre-pandemic, and they had a bright green exit sign off to the side by the entrance/exit of the theater, and that bright green exit sign was lighting up the bottom left of the corner. So if you're aiming your meter down there and the exit light's on, it's gonna give you green. Your meter's gonna tell you extra green. And this happened to you recently with some LEDs like that was built into the customer's chairs or something, right?
Yes, yeah. So that's it's interesting because the blue LEDs they're everywhere. They're all over our equipment. They're on the front, power buttons or just buttons anywhere. And it's the sort of low. They don't even have to be excessively bright, but our eyes don't always pick it up as much as what our meters are actually picking up. And the key was I knew the LEDs were there. I kind of saw it on the screen. I thought, oh, I gotta kill those things because they're gonna affect my low level readings. Right. And then it wasn't until I actually put my phone up to the screen to take a picture of what I was doing, where I saw my camera was able to pick up how much it was actually being thrown onto the screen. I'm like, wow, okay, that was like a really big eye opener here. I talk to clients, and I think people like LEDs, people like glowing things, and it makes them feel like there's a bit of pride in the equipment, because it's cool. And look at my LED strip, they all go down. But in the end, if they're facing the screen, and heck, sometimes it's even like in the little stairwells at the bottom, where people have the steps. That does take away from the contrast ratio that we see, because having that illumination, extra light in the room, that takes away from the only light that should matter, which is coming off the screen in the presentation. That affects it. So yes, anytime you're doing a calibration, if you have any kind of blue LEDs or any LEDs that are floating around that room, just take something, put something up against the wall, bring some tape. I think you were suggesting when we were talking about this initially, somebody was mentioning that there's a certain strip you can put over top of it that's easy to kind of pull off. And definitely, because it will, and it has on my meter shown up as erroneous readings, and we want to make sure that that is not part of the equation when we're measuring.
And funny enough, it's a really simple solution. Is I have a roll of black electrical tape with me, and I also typically bring some microfiber towels, because if I'm running, let's say I'm running a LUT or something like that, or whatever I'm doing, it doesn't really matter. I'll turn the laptop screen down as much as it can go down, and then I'll drape the microfiber cloth over the screen to make sure the screen isn't somehow polluting the readings. And depending on your generator, like the Murideo 6G is a good example, because the screen will dim or completely go out over a certain amount of time, so that's really helpful. But for those out there who have the 7G, there's no way to turn that backlight of that screen in the generator off. Something we're working on, but I'll just drape a microfiber towel over that screen to kill the light there too. And just an extra little tidbit, you should always have a microfiber cloth with you anyway, because we want to be able to wipe off the customer's screen on a flat panel once we're done with it. Exactly.
Okay, yes, that too. And sometimes the lens on the projector, because if the clients have had a projector installed for a very long time, sometimes it needs a little bit of which I can say in advance as well. I always encourage people to clean out their filters prior to me coming. So it really depends on, if it's a new install, obviously they wouldn't have to happen, but if they've had it for a few years, always check for the lamp hours, filters, make sure all that stuff's clean.
As far as the room lighting goes, I've sent you pictures of this before, but I switched my house around recently. So I used to have the OLED in the surround system in the main bedroom, because it's really long and it just worked perfect. But one of the best improvements I made to the system wasn't adding a component or changing my wires or anything like that. One of the best improvements I made to the system was covering up all the lights that the electronics were making, and making the wall behind the TV itself black. So there were absolutely no reflections. Absolutely. I mean, this isn't something you're going to see all the time, but I do have some clients who their room is literally pitch black. Like, they have lined the walls and the ceiling with something like duvetine or some sort of velvet type of black cloth. The carpets are black, the chairs are black, And when you're in that kind of situation, you're literally like only seeing the light coming off the screen. So I do find it very important to do that. Also, what I see a lot on some AVRs, a lot of those typically do have really bright lights and screens on the front to tell you what mode you're in and all that fun stuff. A lot of AVRs, you can turn those screens completely off. So you can at least maybe do that without having to put, you know, a cloth or maybe some sort of electrical tape all over
Yeah,
the
they have like an
front of
auto
it.
function that after you change the control, it shuts
It
itself
just goes
down.
dark. Yeah, I love that. And
Yeah.
if the rack, go
Okay.
ahead. If the rack is in the same room as the equipment, I'm a really big fan of getting a rack where the glass is very, 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 very dark tinted. That way, a lot of these problems that we're talking about kind of fix themselves.
I like that. I never thought about that. I mean, that's something I could
Yeah,
talk to the
yeah,
dealers about. So,
yeah. And, you know,
and I think you know, this kind of goes a bit beyond projector calibration, but there's things to consider for it is precisely the room, Jason. It's about like the room itself is the projection house, and
right.
that's the room that needs to contain the light, you know, for its focus. Those are things that are a little bit beyond us as a calibrator, but we, you know, if you're ever consulting with somebody in advance of building the theater, you can talk about, you know, having a black accent wall where the screen is, whether it's a TV or whether it's a front projector. You can talk
Yeah,
about running neutral, non-glossy grays throughout the theater
yeah,
if you don't want to have a completely blacked out room. And
yeah,
you know, as you see on my Instagram, and for anybody that's at Video Calibrations, you'll see that other people may have other choices. They want either red seats or they want
oh yeah,
to keep the ceiling white because somebody else in the house doesn't
yeah,
want a black ceiling. So those are things you will have to fight with, but because when you're putting up test patterns, you'll see, especially with the screens that are really close to the ceiling, that light just comes right back down onto the screen, especially if it's a unity gain screen of sort.
right,
So those are some things that we can't sort of change because that's already in existence. We could just make recommendations afterwards.
sure,
I've had many people that say, you know, when they put their screen up on the wall and there was like a white wall behind it, and I say, you know what, just paint that wall black or
yeah,
dark gray, and you wouldn't believe the perceived contrast
oh
that we
yeah,
get as a result of it,
yeah,
because the whole goal is for that frame to, the frame around the screen should extend beyond that and be part of the wall. So visually,
right,
our eyes are just focused only
yeah,
on that image, and that changes everything dramatically. Clients do it all the time, and they'll text me afterwards and they'll say, I changed it.
yeah,
Look at it. It was so amazing.
yeah,
Everything just
dude.
pops more. I'm like,
I
yes.
I was just about to say, if anybody's a Reddit user and there's a subreddit called r/home theater, and people will post their theaters and they'll say, oh, isn't this great, I just finished the theater and the walls are white and stuff like that, and in the comments, people, and myself included, people will be like, dude, just one favor, take the screen off the wall, paint that wall black, use a non-glossy, not even satin, maybe like a flat matte black paint.
Yeah.
And sure enough, a couple weeks, a couple months later, there's a new post by the same person with a new picture with the wall behind the screen black, and just like you just said, they go, "Oh my God, this is so much better."
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
And it's just education, right? Because if you don't know, you're not going to do it. It's just
yeah,
you have a design in the room. That's what they thought, and that's why we're here. That's what we're professionals. That's what we do.
yeah,
We make recommendations.
yeah. I like the fact that people are doing do-it-yourself stuff, but sometimes I'll see something that's just way out of whack. I went to a guy's house one time in the theater. He had a nice projector, the right screen, really nice audio and all this other stuff, but the walls in the theater were yellow, and I was like, oh, I was like, man, you got so close. You got so
Mm-hmm.
close to getting this right. But the other thing I see too is somebody will have, like, if you're looking ahead at the screen, on the side walls, they'll have like movie posters under, you know, plexiglass or glass
Yeah.
frames, and you see the reflection of the movie you're watching in the frame. And not only does that take you out of the movie, but to your eyes and your brain, it's lowering the contrast because now you have bright light over here off to the side. So it looks cool, and I get it. But yeah, these are just all the little things you don't really have to worry about with flat panels, which is kind of why we're here.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, do we want to discuss a little bit about flat, like what we want to achieve with flat panels and projectors? Or?
Yeah, let's I do. And if you have oops, I'm gonna give you a second because I think you froze on me. Let's see if it catches up here. Stand by. Ooh, I think I may have totally lost Mike. Mike, if you can hear me, just hop back in whenever you get reconnected. But you know, a lot of the stuff like we were talking about just comes down to room design. And if you're working with a dealer or you have somebody who's reached out to you about doing a projection system in their room, just talk to them about these things: the color of the walls, the having posters and stuff like that in the room, causing reflections, LED lights that are either on the equipment or maybe on the stage. I'll call it the risers, if you will, where the chairs are at. And these are all things to improve the contrast, which really at the end of the day is the most important thing with projection. Yeah, Mike, we got you back, and I was just sort of kind of recapping what we were talking about there. But the next thing I kind of want to move on to, unless you have any last thoughts on that little subtopic.
No, I think we can move on from that.
Okay, cool. Another thing that I really find so important is choosing the right, we'll talk about size first, is choosing the right screen size. And here's why. And I show this to people and they go, oh my God, that makes so much sense. I'll take a flashlight and I'll get really close to a wall and shine the flashlight on the wall. Small picture, but bright. I move the flashlight back a little bit. I've got a bigger picture, but it's more dim. So where a flat panel or an emissive display, you can sit close, you can sit far, and the perception of how bright it is going to be probably mostly the same for most people. But man, there are so many times where I see somebody will get way too big of a screen for the projector, or they, I actually saw something the opposite last week, which was really fun. It was a Sony GTZ 380 on a 140-inch screen, and it was just lighting the screen up like crazy. It was awesome. Yeah, and then what I always kind of equate this to, if you're into cars a lot, there's a very famous modification you can do to a Mazda Miata, and that's putting an LS1 motor in it. So big motor, small car, lots of fun, right? So let's talk a little bit about how that light dispersion happens and how your dynamic range takes a major hit if the screen's too big.
Yeah, definitely. And what you brought up is a very common thing. So when we first started calibrating years ago, when I think when I first started, front projection screens, to be honest with you, I was seeing 84 inches.
Yeah, that was big back then. Yeah, I remember 96 was huge.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was even Runco at the time. They were getting their statistics when they were trying to deal with real specifications. I think they were doing it on a 78-inch or a 72-inch or something. Because I mean, screen size have gotten larger, and it's amazing to look now at a 77-inch TV or an 84-inch. I'm like, wow, that was front projection a few years ago.
Yeah,
exactly. Or so years ago, but so we become accustomed to larger screen sizes, and then we get to 110 seemed to be about the average several years ago, but now we're at the time now when we can go bigger, and bigger's fun. I mean, that's why we want to we want that big screen experience. We want to feel like we're in the theater, draw ourselves into the film, whatever our reasons. But keeping an eye on screen size versus the projector choice is so critical, especially in the era of high dynamic range where light output is required. And so I think sticking with manufacturer specifications or keeping an eye on them versus like how far away the projector is being mounted, whether or not one is going to go 2.4 to 1, and do the zoom versus an anamorphic lens, all those factors are gonna matter with light output. So the goal is that we'll want to maintain as much light output as possible. Well, not as possible, but up to about 100 nits for regular HD standard dynamic range, and then everything on top of it is all gravy for HDR. So thinking about these back on one, say, if you're back, say, 30 feet on a projector and you go 160 inches and you're putting, say, a $6,000 projector in there by any of the manufacturers, it's not going to be enough light for the screen. It just hands down not. And that's especially if it's acoustically transparent.
That's a whole other thing.
Oh gosh, we'll be down at high dynamic range. The maximum might be 60 nits. Why do I know this? Because I've measured it many times. I've been in that situations. So having that conversation in advance is like, especially if somebody calls you and says, you know, hey, I want to do, I have a TV set, thank you for calibrating it, I want to do a front projector, what should I do? You know, and then you could say, well, hey, well, let's think about what you want, and let's be realistic on either the budget and the appropriate screens for the room. So definitely, so I guess before we move this conversation on, we want to make sure that we hit those targets, or at least reasonable targets, in order to get the best picture quality for both standard dynamic range HD and high dynamic range UHD.
I just for testing purposes, and I had it at my house for a little while, but my house is not quite right for front projection. But the point is, it's an 85-inch 235:1 screen, so it's long, but it's not very tall. And I'll tell you, man, even with like an 1800 lumen projector, man, it lights that screen up so well. But it's not a huge screen, so I don't have to put the projector way far back, and you know, I can kick the lamp into high mode for HDR, and it's just a lot of fun. But you know, sitting close enough might get you that roughly 30-degree viewing angle that we always try to aim for the most part, at least. But the point of the story is, you know, big engine, small car. That's where things get really fun. The GTZ 380 I did the other day on the small screen of 140 or 160 inches. If that thing was at full tilt, it was like 294 nits. It was absolutely insane. But it wasn't a dedicated theater. It was sort of a TV watching room, but they had completely blacked out shades. So when they closed the shades, it was really, really dark in there, but the walls were a light color and stuff like that. But the point is, he had so much light that it was able to keep up with the deficiencies of the room lighting, and it was no problem. But that's an extreme example. You know, it's a $90,000. Well, by the time you add a lens, it's a $90,000 projector. But it's also 10,000 lumens, so it's a whole other beast.
It is. Yeah, and I think if I think about average screen sizes, so I'll just pick a couple out right now. So, I mean, I know that, say, like a 110-inch screen, that's an 8-foot wide screen. That one, for the most part, majority projectors out there can illuminate that screen wonderfully for both standard dynamic range and really give a good kick on high dynamic range. You can be up well over 160, 180, depending on the projector. Sometimes you can get over 200 nits. And if the 2.4 version to that would be approximately a 10-foot wide screen. If I say width, I'm referring to just left to right. So a 10-foot wide screen, which I think is about 133 or 136 or so. Again, we can achieve those numbers relatively easily with the base of Epson projectors that are out there, the JVCs that are out there, the Sonys that are out there. So that will deliver a really good picture. Once we start going beyond 110, so 120s in a 16:9, 130, 140, it's always reasonable to expect that we're going to start going down on light output and down pretty quickly, especially once we start getting up to the 140 inches. If your projector is back 20 feet or more, then that obviously drops even more, and especially with acoustically transparent screens. So as a calibrator, what we can only do, if the system's already installed, we can only abide to the standards that we need to calibrate to, and we need to make judgment calls in terms of, where do we want to put our laser light setting or a lamp setting, right? Because we can't redesign the system. Once it's in there, once the screen size is already there, once the projector is already mounted in that spot, we have to work with that. Whereas we don't have to work with that on a flat panel, right? You got an 86-inch screen or a 90, or heck, I calibrated a 100-inch Sony the other day. Those are big panels, but it's an 800 nit HDR display. It doesn't matter. It's huge, right? It's the same thing as a 77-inch OLED or so. But once you go to those sizes with front projection, then it's always realistic to think about what kind of light output do I want and what's going to give a good experience. And I think this is where we need to become realistic with the client. They're sticking 100% to the standard as much as possible, and then there's considering, well, what's going to be the overall experience that the person's going to watch. And do I need to keep low setting for SDR, even though the screen is massive, and run it in high for HDR? It may not make sense if that's the case, because SDR we'd just be far too dim, so we might need to bring it up and bring the laser light setting up, bring the lamp setting up, in order to close the gap on the experiences that was pretty much lost because either the projector is too far back, or the screen size is too big, or in this case here, if they're using a dark screen that doesn't really have a gain, that's actually darker than a 1.0 gain screen, that also cuts back light quite significantly. And there's quite a few manufacturers out there that do that, even though they spec out a high gain number, but they don't actually measure that way.
That's a really good point too, because just trying to match up a screen with a projector, there's so many choices out there for screens. You can go on Amazon and buy a screen for $100 if you want to. But something I always try to think about too is screen size, how bright the projector is, and how good the blacks are. So as an example, if I have a really dim projector on a really big screen, the last thing I'm going to recommend is a dark gray screen. But if it's the other way, if I have a really bright projector and I want really good black, then I can go with a darker screen, like that job with the Sony I'm telling you about. They could have gotten more. They could have gotten better black levels if they've gone with a darker gray screen, and they did it, and that's totally okay. They still had plenty of light to work with, and it still looked really good. But I like where your mind's at, because we tend to be sticklers on getting the numbers right and being exactly 100 nits if it's a flat panel, and all this other stuff. But then there's reality, and is this room a perfect room to hit those numbers? Maybe not, and you got to get a little creative, which is why I always talk about this as being sort of a mix of art and science. And it's really no different than what you do in an audio system. I've been shopping lately for some new cables. I got a new amplifier that you and I have talked about, and I want to get some new cables for it. And I have to check myself and be like, at what point, I don't have a dedicated 2-channel listening room. It's in a living room. And I've got an air conditioner running. I can hear the compressor of the refrigerator kick on. So at what point do I say these cables I want to spend all this money on it is overkill? And what do you do to combat that, right? So just taking what you have to work with and making the best of it is a lot of times what you do. And sometimes what I'll say is, what annoys you the least? Do I want a lower noise floor if it's an audio system, or am I good dealing with a lower noise floor if it means something else about the system will be better? So finding those compromises, I think, are super important.
And it's our experience that we draw on as calibrators, right? And we see a lot of systems, and my experience in the post-production world, I'll know what they need for perfect, right? And in the consumer world, I think we all need to be realistic, is that a lot of times, consumer displays don't operate like a Sony BBM HX310. Like they just don't. There's going to be some limitations to them in terms of color, in terms of light output. And a consumer display, for those people who are watching TV sets in a normal living room, well, a normal living rooms have white lights, like what I have behind me right now. They've got white walls, white ceilings, and even with the lights completely off. And this is where a lot of people, make a mistake. They say, "Oh, I watch TV with the lights off." Well, even with the lights completely off, your TV is a light source. It's illuminating the walls. It's illuminating the ceiling, and all that light is bouncing right back to your eyes. It's bouncing back to the display. It's lifting the overall room value, if I can call it that, in terms of light. And in a studio environment, majority of the studios I do work for are either 100% black or very, very dark gray with a lot of gray materials. So their eyes are just legitimately focused on that one spot. So setting up a television set at home in standard dynamic range to 100 nits as a reference white is not appropriate for the average living room, because, again, if we want to be sticklers and stick right with the standard, that's going to be too dim. And you're going to have a lot of unhappy people when you leave, and they're going to be complaining and say, "Well, why did you say it that way?" Right? So some people call it a dark mode, but even then, unless, again, you're sitting a certain distance from the display, as a post-production does, because they're very close to it, and if your room is very dark, 100 nits is not, for a television set, not really an enjoyable achievement. So you can pump it up 120, 140, 160. You have to kind of gauge the room itself.
Yeah. The other thing, and if you guys have ever looked into post-production, like as a maybe you're watching like bonus features on a disc of how the movie was made, and they're showing people working in the studios, you'll see that the studios are pitch black typically. They might have a bias light behind the screen to help with eye strain and stuff like that. But they're looking at a 32 to 40-inch monitor, maybe 18 inches away. So when they're grading and they're making that movie look a certain way, you have to deviate from that when you're dealing with a bright living room like what you have behind you. You just have to. You have to. Let's touch a little bit. We won't spend a lot of time here, but I do want to touch on a little bit, sort of like some pros and cons about fixed screens versus screens that roll up or even roll down.
Okay.
I noticed in my experience with this stuff, the drop-down screens are usually pretty cool, but I do see a lot of things that kind of bother me about them. And number one is they wiggle, they vibrate. So I'm a big fan of fixed screens. Yeah, exactly. You breathe on it too hard, and it moves around and it wiggles, and you start running into all these distractions that take you away from the movie. So what are some of your thoughts maybe on a fixed screen versus one that drops down from the ceiling?
Great question. I think they both serve very important purposes in the room, and it's thinking about the intention of the room. So if one has the idea that they want their dedicated home theater to be the reference statement screen, that's all they want to focus on, they want to make it around that, then a fixed screen would be the best way to do it.
Right.
Drop-down screens there's many different drop-down screens, as you know. Some of them are the cheapest are hand-pulled. Outside of that, when they're motorized, they have no tension, so they just drop down, and as a result, there's a bit of a wiggle throughout the screen. There's nothing that we can correct because the outsides might be in a little bit further than the insides. And then there's those that are tab tension, so they're pulled really tightly in order to be as close as a fixed screen as possible. And in those rooms there, anybody who has a drop down that's tab tension, it's usually a multi-purpose room. So maybe they have a flat panel that's on the wall that's behind it. They want the screen up. It might be a pool table in the back. It's a multi-use living room for kids and family. And then when the movie comes on, then the screen drops down. And that's great. I totally support that because a lot of screen companies out there, they'll have the reference screen materials that you can buy even as a fixed screen and get that same image quality. The only thing that we can't always account for, and I think this is important for the consumer, is to just do a little investigation to see what drop-down screens last over a period of time. Sometimes the mechanics can burn out a lot faster in some companies. Others, when they roll up and roll back down multiple times, they start leaving marks across the screen, tab indentations. There's a lot of issues that can arise, and that's something that you really can't tell unless you just do a search online and see who's offering what. So in the end, with a drop-down screen, you could have those issues, but the reputable manufacturers are fairly bulletproof in terms of having a good quality over a longer period of time. Myself, I'm a fan of a fixed screen if I can, and I like everything pulled nice and tightly, and I like the frame. It's just such a statement look.
The other thing to think about too with drop-down screens is the cool factor. So, when you come in and you've got, Savant or, Crestron or whoever as your control system, man, when you hit a button and the lights go out and the screen motorizes down, there's such a cool piece to that. But you brought up something before that I absolutely love. Every time I see this, I'm like, this is the way to do it, is you'll have a big OLED or a big flat panel on the wall, and then when it's movie time, to watch the news and stuff, but when it's movie time or even sports time or video game time, whatever, you've got the big giant screen that drops down in front. So there's still a cool factor to it that I don't think you don't have to worry about that with a flat panel. You just slap it on the wall and you're done. But you can
I think it's also good that we put a variable wear on it, right? If you're just watching, CNN or stuff, watching on the panel versus having a projector lamp or laser being burned out for that reason, it's okay to switch between the two.
That's a good point. I mean, I've been to some jobs before where they do have two displays like that, and I'm like, oh, this is a great little system. How long have you had the system? And just asking them sort of general questions like that. And they're like, oh yeah, we've had this system for a year. Say, okay, well, how often do you watch movies? And they say, yeah, sometimes on the weekends, or I'm out of town a lot because I work out of town, yada yada yada. So you'll check the hours on the projector, and even though it's a year old, it's got 36 hours on it. So I love that point you made. Is if you have two displays in the same room for that kind of stuff, it's a lot less wear and tear on the projector. And on that topic, let's talk a little bit about bulbs versus laser and pros and cons and when you should do what. So I'll start and I'll say this. I'm a big advocate, I'm a big stickler of not letting the picture get too dim over time. So in other words, and I'll just say this to keep the math super simple. Let's say you calibrate the projector and it's 100 nits, and then you come back a year, 2 years later to just check everything, or maybe they want something else so you're there anyway. I'm gonna go ahead and measure the projector. And if it's down to 80 nits, then to me, you don't see that degradation over time. But I saw immediately because I was there, and now it's like, why is it so dim? You check the hours, and the projector's got 6 hours and hours on it because that's all they watch. Yeah. So my recommendation is once you get 20, maybe 30% loss of light output, time for a new bulb, and then the old bulb that's not as bright anymore might become your backup bulb.
Yeah. Yeah, so I would agree with you on that. And I think it's gonna vary for the clients in terms of how much that's important to them. So and also up to this point, as we know that everything's been lamp-based and lasers are relatively new compared to what we've been doing in the past. So I started taking some data from my repeat clients where I'd come back and do a touch-up calibration because, as you know, as the lamp is used over a period of time, you do have to go in and touch it up. You're just got to get back to D65. But I would take kind of mental notes on at what hour on the projector, a timer, how far down are we from the original light output. So I'll check the original report to see what I would have measured it at, and I'd compare. So I'm finding that when you're starting to hit around 12 to 1400 hours on a lamp, you're down about 20%, 20 to 25% on your light output. And in the past, before high dynamic range, I think it was okay that we could kind of get by for a little bit longer than that. But in the era of HDR, and I do say this, where we do want to keep those bright highlights as bright as possible, a 20% loss of light is...
That's a lot.
Yeah. Especially if the screen size is big, or if you're doing a 2.4 to 1 image, you need that light. So for my clients that keep that high in their importance, they'll make sure they replace the lamp somewhere between 12 and 1400 hours, and just to keep that high brightness and keep the lamp as a backup in the just in case, right, in the older one.
Sure.
And can you extend further than that? Can you go to 1800 hours? Could you go to 2000 hours? Of course you can. It's within spec of the manufacturer, but you have to be able to accept that you're going to be down 30%, 35%, because the lamp light, as we know, doesn't go straight on and just turn off. It's going on and down and down. And just as you said, you're not going to see it because you get so used to it. It's not until you pop the new lamp in, it's like, oh my gosh, what happened to that light? It's back again. So lasers, as you say, is a lot more stable over a period of time, and the drop is minor once you get, I think they're specifying past 10,000 hours, you start maybe using like 5%, 10% or so over a period of time. But I think a lot of that still needs to be tested because lasers are still relatively new in our market, and we're just starting to exit the lamp business in projection.
And one thing I will say, because I hear this all the time, and you and I have talked about it. We've both posted about this on the socials. But guys, please spend the extra money and get the manufacturer bulb. Do not even waste your time on a third-party bulb. They're usually way weaker, and a lot of times they're a completely different color.
Yes.
So I'm a huge advocate. I've straight up told people, oh, well, this bulb's $300 and the bulb from the manufacturer is $700. And I go, I don't care how much it is. Just get the original bulb.
No, and a lot of those websites will say these are OEM lamps and they're built for the manufacturer. Oh, yeah, well, I've had clients that bought them and we've measured them and they're inferior to the lamp I was replacing.
Right, exactly.
Darker than the lamp that was darker than the original lamp, right? And plus, of course, we don't know how they'll behave. I mean, there are stories from one of the manufacturers I deal with here of them blowing up inside of the unit, like a non-lamp. So, of course, you want to avoid all those things. It's not worth it to buy the fake lamps. And if people have, and if you got away with it, okay, But
Yeah.
remember that lamp replacements. I always tell people it's the cost of enjoyment. So we bought a home
Right.
theater. We're here to enjoy it. You spent the money on it initially. The lamp is just going to keep it rolling like an oil change on a car. I hate using those examples, right? But it's true.
Yeah, and the other thing I like to mention too is, and you sort of briefly touched on this before, the biggest killer of electronics in general, typically, is heat. So, if you've had a projector up there 2, 3, 4, 5 years and you keep replacing the bulb, make sure you're doing a little bit of other maintenance too. Clean the filters, maybe, blow out some dust, and do what you can so that projector's running nice and cool as long as possible, and that helps with the longevity as well.
Yeah, and it's good. Sometimes you can have like an air spray can in your kit if you want to. Sometimes you get projectors that are really dusty, and you got to kind of give it a little bit of a spray. When if the projector's old, sometimes I'll open up the back, and just as a courtesy, I'll take a look at the prism inside, because sometimes they certain models got a little bit dusty where the lamp is supposed to be shining the light through, so that'll increase your light output as well. So there's a little bit of other maintenance that we can do if we know the projector well enough.
I've done a couple in the past where I'm just looking at the screen and I'm like, man, something is just not right. Like, it's maybe one part of the screen is sort of a blur to it, and it turns out you go look at the physical lens and there's a thumbprint somewhere on the lens. So going back to the whole microfiber cloth thing, this is something I might check before I might wipe that lens off before I even start taking out my gear. So that's a good point. Now, comparing to lasers, one thing I've noticed with the lasers is that it's typically a green or it's typically a laser phosphor, so it's not triple laser, but we will see more and more of that going forward. But I noticed that they're extremely unstable in the first 40, maybe 80, maybe even 100 hours. So, we've always practiced in the past, let's wait 100, 200 hours or whatever to calibrate the TV. And I'm thinking nowadays it's even more important to go past 100 hours to get the stability back on lasers. Are you seeing that too?
So I haven't, usually with my clients, when people call me for a job, and they ask me if they have to run a certain amount of hours, typically I wouldn't see them for about a month anyway, so they usually get some pretty good viewing on their projectors before I get there. So and it's the same thing with the television set. I personally have not measured at 1 hour, at 10 hours, at 100 hours to see how much deviation there has been on a projector. That is something I would be interested in seeing, because with anything, there are shifts of image over a period of time. How have you been finding significant deviations in the image, or is it slight amount on your XY or your luminance values? Like, how far off have you been finding it?
It's typically X and Y. The luminance might still be pretty consistent with 1 hour on the projector, but I see a lot of shifting in the XY. And it's funny we're talking about this because I just got 2 brand new projectors that are still in the box here for my office. So they're 2 different brands, so it might be kind of cool to measure both of them over those first 100 hours to see how they compare to each other with the drifting. But again, and just just another sort of good rule of thumb I when I'm teaching the new calibrators especially is, is it okay to calibrate a projector or a TV brand new out of the box? Absolutely. We all do it to our own TVs, but just expect to make a second appointment to come out there after a couple 100 hours to touch it up a little bit. So it might be one of those situations where you say, okay, well, the projector doesn't have a lot of time on it, but let's go ahead and do it because I'm already here. And, let's just make a second appointment for 3 months from now so I can come just touch it up if it even needs it.
I think touch-up appointments are always really good to have. When you develop a rapport with your client, and they value the service, they see the benefits that it's happened, a touch-up is always good. My studio work, we're touching up all the time. Their touch-up window is far narrower than a student because than a client, because they're in the filmmaking business, so they have to be accurate.
It has to be,
And even if it's drifted by just a little bit, it doesn't matter. It's still drifted, so we still got to get back to exactly where it needs to be. Now, in terms of telling people, do I recommend you waiting for X period of time? And that's a bit of a fuzzy topic for me, because for me, it's, again, as I said, like, it's usually several weeks before I see a client anyway, so they are going to get some viewing on it. But at the same time, though, I do want to say, like, okay, over a period of like 100, 200 hours, 300 hours that they're watching, well, that's times the by two. That's 150 movies they've watched. That's 200 movies they've watched. They've watched a lot of movies uncalibrated during that period of time. So my recommendation is it's actually better to just book the call with the calibrator, get it calibrated. You know, maybe not straight out of the box, but you know, as early as you possibly can. Enjoy all of those movies over it. And if they really want to touch about for the 150-hour, 200-hour mark, if that makes them comfortable, if at that point in time, then get it done again. Just get it touched up, because our rates are different, you know, for touch up versus full calibration. So that's my recommendation. It's like for me personally, do I want to watch my TV uncalibrated for 200 hours first? No, I'm gonna get it done as soon as I can. And if I'm concerned about it later on, I'm gonna get it done again. So
exactly. And one last thing about lamps and lasers, and we'll move on to the next topic. And by the way, guys, you're tossing some excellent questions into the question box. I know I'm not getting to all of them immediately, but we'll leave some time at the end to kind of cover those. So keep those coming in. You know, there's a lot of times where the room might be like super modern, and you don't have to worry about this because the projector is in some sort of like what we like to call a hush box, meaning the projector is in an enclosed box, and you can't see it. You can only see, maybe there's a small window and you can barely see the lens. And I think that's cool because it's a really clean install, and some customers don't want to see the equipment, and I get that. But there's a couple things to think about on this. If you want a lot of HDR, or maybe the screen's a little too big for the projector, your first instinct is to kick the lamp or the laser into its highest mode, which is something that you probably are going to want to do anyway. But just keep in mind too that if the projector's outside of the hush box, you might make the trade-off of, okay, I've got a slightly brighter picture, maybe a more dynamic picture, but now I can hear the fan. So, you know, if you're going to do a hush box, and I just saw this with that Sony I worked on last week, when you got up into the room behind the room and climbed up on the ladder, man, you would stick your head up there by the projector, and it was ice cold because they had like an AC system, a cooling system in the box that the projector was in. So think about noise, think about heat when you're and again, you know, if you're there to calibrate it, you can't do anything about this stuff, but if you are involved on the design side, the design side, I do think it's really important to have that conversation about where the projector is going to go and how loud the fan might be. But what I will say, on most of the laser phosphor-based projectors, they're not nearly as loud. And if you take something like that GTZ 380, it's liquid cooled. So the fans that are in there are extremely quiet anyway, because most of the cooling's, you know, done by liquid. So just a few things to think about.
Some of them run louder, some of them run quieter. It depends on the size of the unit. In this case here, the 380 is a mega piece. It's awesome, and it doesn't run as hot as, say, some of the smaller ones that are out there. But yeah, hush boxes are great, and just make sure that cooling is required on it, and also make sure that you can pull the projector out easily if you need to. Some of them are built in, as you may have seen on my Instagram at Video Calibration. Somebody built in their projector and they had to rip out trim work just to get to it. You know, it's like, we laughed at it, right? But you know, we had a chuckle. But it's really important to kind of consider all those things with the design. And if it's possible, like if one is concerned about, you know, utilizing the lamp at its high rate all the time, or the laser at its high rate all the time, considering the system design for the proper screen size, the right throw distance, to be able to use the lamp or the laser in low mode for standard dynamic range and still get a really good picture quality, I think that's key for longevity, right? Because we don't want to be running this thing in high for everything all the time.
Right. No, good call. Okay, so next thing we'll talk about is something that is exclusive to projectors and not on flat panels, is the aperture. So let's talk this isn't a huge topic to go on and on about, I don't think, but let's just talk about the basics. A, what is an aperture? And B, when should you use it? And in some cases, on a lot of projectors, you can turn it completely off. And then you also a lot of times have an auto setting to where the aperture might open and close based on how bright or dark the content is. So apertures are just like what you'd see in a camera. You know, it can go really big, it can go really small, depending on the light output. With apertures, I'm not a big fan of this, and I want to get your opinion, or anybody who's listening, type it into the chat box. I find it very distracting, usually when it's on auto, because it has this, what I can call a pumping effect. As the picture gets brighter or darker, you can see the projector working. So what do you take into consideration when you're trying to decide what to do with the aperture?
That's a great question, and it really depends on the projector. It depends on the screen size. It depends on the screen material. I think I look at everything as a system, as like an ecosystem. You know,
Right.
it all matters. Say for example, if the projector screen is too large, then I want to get the most light output as possible,
Right.
because that's going to take priority over the darkest black. If I'm at a point where the projector is pretty close to the screen, and I've got excessive light that I don't want, I will manually bring it back. My black level will improve, my contrast improves. So, and then there's some, let's say for example, the new Epson laser, having that mode on drops the black level down pretty good, and you still get that nice bright output. And so that's where a situation where I would leave that auto function turned on, because it actually does improve the picture quality, and in my opinion, based on, you know, especially clients using a white screen, because you know, when you turn that off with that particular projector, the black levels raise quite high, and it really is a judgment call. And I think that's as a calibrator, we sort of make that call based on the information that we measure off the screen, based on the full system that we're looking at.
Sure. No, that's a good point. The other thing I think is good to mention too, when you're dealing with projection, and we don't see it too much anymore, but there is still rear projection that exists, where the projector, if you guys who are listening haven't seen this before, and I don't see it often anymore, it's super rare, I feel like, in my case at least, but they'll put the projector behind the screen in its own little room. But a lot of those same rules apply. So, you know, make that room as dark as you can, make it as cool as you can for the projector. And I saw it, the last time I saw a good rear projection system was at the Monterey Bay Aquarium in California. And it was cool because their kind of boardroom was right on the ocean. So a lot of these things that we're talking about with contrast and light output, we're still concerned with what's coming off the screen, but it's a lot easier to achieve that stuff when the room's kind of hidden. Are you still seeing some rear projection stuff?
No. I'm sure they exist out there. In a home environment, I haven't seen rear projection in a long time. In fact, I was at a job 3 weeks ago or so where the client had a rear projection system that was installed by a dealer relatively local to me several years ago, and I hadn't been brought into that job to calibrate it, so I don't even know what it was. But he had the mirror system with the projector down and going off the mirror and onto the screen, a rigid screen that was put into the wall. So he had that replaced with front projection in that case. So he chose not to. So my experience with rear projection in with the digital era of projectors outside of the ones that came in the all-in-one box is relatively limited.
Yeah, cool. No, good. Another thing that comes up all the time, and this is very controversial, so if you're listening to this, don't get too mad at us, but we do hear a lot of times that people are calibrating the projector with a meter aimed at the lens and not at the screen. And I get that to an extent if you're trying to, like, let's see what the projector's native contrast ratio is with no screen. So you measure it and it's like, wow, this is awesome. And then you put the screen in and you're measuring off the screen is part of the system. So the contrast, the overall light output, maybe what happens with the grayscale all change. So I just really wanted to point out that the screen is part of the system. The proper way to do this is to measure off the screen. And I think you'll agree with me.
Oh, you and I agree with that both. I mean, if you want to gather statistics on the projector only, then sure, aim it at the lens. But that's not how we're watching movies. That's not how movies are being made. As we know, the screen in the room and the various screen, well, I would say the millions of screen options that are out there, size, etc. That's all going to change the way the picture quality is finally seen. So no, we need to consider the screen and measure from the screen.
And you know, that might be one of those things. that might be one of those things too, where I mean, our entire industry is dictated by marketing in most cases. So for audio fans out there, especially car audio, you'll get these sort of exaggerated numbers for power output. So it might say it's a 1500 watt amplifier, but it's got a 15 amp fuse. And you're thinking, well, how'd they get this number? Well, maybe the gain was all the way up. Maybe the output stage was all the way up. Maybe it's at one specific frequency. Maybe it's clipped to death, but the amp hasn't failed yet. So they'll say, okay, well, that was 1500 watts. That's great. So maybe in projection, the manufacturers, and I'm not, I don't know this for sure. I'm just kind of talking out of my nose here, but they might get these incredible contrast ratio numbers because they're aiming at the lens. And I don't know if that's going on, but it might be sort of a manipulated specification of the projector. I don't know.
We really don't know what's going on behind the scenes, where they're getting these numbers from. And I think for the most part, when I talk to people, I just say, let's just forget about the marketing. You and I have had experience on so many different projectors. We know how they operate. We know what certain screen materials and screen companies, we know what they do. We have a good baseline in terms of how they'll actually perform in a home. And that's really the only thing to go for, I think, in my point of view, because stressing about whether this one has 1950 lumens and this projector here is marketed as having 1900 lumens, so the other one must be better. That's futile. There'd be no point in doing that because we know there's far more to that story.
Right. Now, we talk about getting the projector aligned. We talk a lot about room and screen size and all these things that don't matter with flat panels. Let's maybe just touch lightly on what's the same with a flat panel. So we'll start with something simple: white level, black level, gamma, grayscale, all the things that affect dynamic range. The projector is going to have the same settings as your flat panel will have. So there's nothing that you really have to do any differently. But what I will say is more important is sometimes you have to take into consideration that the screen itself might be shifting color a little bit. So we've seen plenty of times where the screen is slightly blue. So it might look a certain way based on what's measured, but at the end of the day, your white point is your white point. Your contrast is your contrast. Your black level is your black level. And depending on the room, your gamma is still going to be the same target, whether it's 2.4 or 2.2 or whatever. Calibrating the color gamut, there's nothing different there. You have your targets. Maybe you're going for Rec 709. You're using your software. You know where those colors should land on the CIE chart. You know how bright those colors should be. So I would say that after you get all the mechanical stuff worked out and all the room stuff worked out, when it comes to actually looking at test patterns and taking readings off the screen, it's not that much different from a television. What do you think?
Yeah, so televisions are very straightforward, and I think it's absolutely incredible, and this is props to TVs, that the quality of TVs these days for the price point that they're available at is absolutely insane.
Yeah,
it's like a lot of these TV sets that could be had for $2,500, can look like a reference monitor or quite close to it. I mean, there's subtle differences, but the gap is not huge in some circumstances. So amazing for the manufacturers for doing the wonderful work that they're doing on certain models. And of course, there are budget models out there that won't quite achieve the same kind of level. But hey, that's why some cost more than others. But with front projectors, we do want to use those same standards. So we're looking at D65 as the white point. I always aim for 2.4 gamma. And the reason why I do that is because that's what all my studios are doing. Every single studio is doing 2.4. Okay? 2.2 is always the preset in television sets and projectors, but the content that you're watching on all your 4K Blu-ray discs is 2.4, with the exception of YouTube videos. YouTube commercials are 2.2.
Okay, good. I did not know that. Thank you. Thanks for thanks for dropping that little nugget. I didn't know that. Now, I'm trying to think about, and if you guys in the chat have any other thoughts on it, at least off the top of my head right now, I can't think of too many more things when it comes to the four important parts of the picture that would be very different from a projector versus a flat panel.
Let me make a quick comment, Jason, and this is around the screen material type. So I think as a calibrator, what you'll notice is that when you have a fairly neutral colored screen, There's one or two of them out there that are very neutral, and others some shift, as you know, blue or reddish or greenish when you put it up to that neutral. Some screens, though, when we're trying to achieve D65 or when we're trying to achieve that nice gamma response, or even doing color management, that the more we move away from a neutral white screen, sometimes we need to change the controls on the projector a little bit more aggressively than we normally would, because you have to, especially if the screen has a very large color shift, because I could put a white light, I know it will measure D65 on my sample, because I always bring a neutral screen sample with me, and I can see, oh my gosh, this screen is really magenta. Well, we're gonna have to pull that out, so I might have to really swing my grayscale controls a lot harder than what I would normally on any screen. So, and it'd be very difficult to say, well, hang on a second, online this review showed these settings on their grayscale, they posted this, these are the settings, why are mine like all over the map? I'm like, well, okay, well, we're not comparing apples to apples here. We're trying to achieve the same targets, but how we get there is gonna be a different story because of the screen.
Yeah, no, good. So we're running close out of time. We're actually a little bit over, so thank you guys for hanging in there. We can, we could do this for hours, and maybe based on your guys' feedback, we could even do a part 2. But I did want to go through. Oh yeah. So actually, no. Let's talk about that, and then because I think that's really important. And then we'll get to the questions. So if you guys want to hang in there just a little bit longer, if you have to drop off, I totally understand. We're going to put this on YouTube a little bit later anyway. So so here's always been the rumor, if you want to call it that, or the standard thing that we hear for projection is there's not enough light output, so there's no point in doing HDR. Just forget about HDR on a projector. And I really wanted to talk to you about this because I know you're super passionate about this very specific topic. But I do know that, I've seen this with my own eyes, and Charles Cooper here in the chat box, he brought this up a little bit earlier, but at what point, when the projector is not bright enough for the screen in the room, at what point do you just throw in the towel and say, hey, we're just going to do everything at SDR? So the first question is when do you throw in the towel and just do SDR? The second question is, if you do have enough light output to do a decent job with HDR, how the heck do we do it?
Okay, so I think it's, and this could go on for a little bit, so I'll try to keep it really tight here. Throwing in the towel. Okay, so first of all, I would think to myself, all right, well, we know that for the home video standard, everything is colored at 100 nits, 2.4 BT709. Okay? Right. We are used to the theatrical standard. We talk about 48 nits or 16-foot Lamberts, whatever it is. So I would think that if your screen size is too large and you only have a certain amount of light output, what do? Okay, so do we set standard dynamic range for what's considered to be acceptable at 48 nits, and then leave the rest for HDR in order to get that extra bit of range? So at least SDR and HDR look a little bit different. What are you willing to, as a viewer, able to, we'll say, compromise with in a system like that? And then when we look in the HDR code values, we have to say, okay, well, if HDR, it's an absolute system. It's, you have a certain amount, you got a code value that is tied to luminance. And when you input a certain code value on a flat panel, no problem. It beams nice and bright, it's good. But projectors are different because we're restricted on the peak white value. And that's why with HDR projector, system design is so important in order to achieve really good levels for high dynamic range. So what am I looking for is like, okay, well, to me, what's good? Being able to hit code 504, which is about 100 nits of the input signal, if we can get that around 30 nits, 35 nits, that's awesome on a front projector. And the rest of the range above that, if you hit code 588 or you go to code 720, which is approximately 1,000 nits, if that's hitting about 170, 180 nits, then that's glory HDR. And it's really about refining the gamma curve on the projector. And if you have the tools to do it, if you're able to manipulate it on the projector, if you know how to set your workflow at that particular way, then you can get some really glorious HDR. Although there are times where, if we have, say for example, I had a projector, it was 32 feet back in a room, and it was on a 160-inch acoustically transparent screen. My maximum light value was like 65, 70 nits max.
Yeah.
I got off of that.
Yeah.
So that is a candidate. That's where you start saying, you know what, HDR. You know what, running something like a frame adapt that JVC has and kind of playing with the control. This is where you have to start making HDR or a little bit more like SDR. You got to decide what are you willing to give up so that it's not a dark experience throughout, because that's going to be the biggest complaint. Is like, okay,
It's too
the
dark.
content is dark. I play Runner 2049 and can't see what's going on in it because it's
Right.
the highest peak is like 150 nits in that. That's way down at the bottom of the gamma curve, right?
Yeah.
So this is a bigger conversation in general. I think we could have, but it's a judgment call on the calibrator and based on the whole system and based on the certain projector that's being used, because they all have a variety of different tone mapping controls that you really need to know and customize.
Yeah. The other thing I've heard fellow calibrators do, which does make sense, is when the projector gets an HDR signal, I'll just use Sony as an example because it's really easy to do on a Sony. You can strip out the HDR but leave in the wide color gamut. So at least when the customer watches HDR, it might not have the dynamic range, but at least it's more colorful. So I see that as being a pretty good compromise if you don't have the light.
Yeah, and the light is so important, right? And it's like, do we want extremely wide contrast but be squinting for half of it, or do we want to get a little bit more light output and enjoy it? And that it really truly is system dependent.
Yeah, exactly. So cool. Again, guys, we can do a part 2 and just go nuts with this and start looking at charts and stuff and really getting deep into it. If you guys want us to do that, let us know. We're here to learn from each other and to. Yeah, exactly. So let's get to some of these questions, and there were some really, really good ones here. So I wanted to make sure we got at least most of them.
And hopefully next time I'll have a headset, so this way I'm not so distorted, because I'm hoping people heard absolutely what I said.
Yeah, no, you're good, man. So let's give me a second here. Let me get to the questions. Oops, wrong button. Let's pop that question box out. Okay. Can his mic be turned down? We already covered that one. Another comment about putting the projector center of the screen as much as you can. Some projectors do have a lens shift, but be careful because some don't. So it's a good thing to research in the system design part of it, is if you can't be dead center, make sure the projector does have some lens shift.
And the hardest ones are the ones with a manual control where you can't feel where the center is after you've adjusted it.
Exactly. Let's see what else here. Bruce from Orlando, who we know, when we're talking about getting the lens centered to the screen, he has a really good tip here. He says you can basically make a triangle with 2 tape measures, and you can actually look at the tape measure and see the exact number, so you're dead center. I do like that. Yeah, Michael says. Try to avoid auto calibration programs tied to projectors and wreck things. And then they didn't tell you that they did that. So I think where Michael's coming from here is you're trying to calibrate their calibration that wasn't very good to begin with. So that's a really good point. Let's see what else here. Bart says, if you have a spectro and a colorimeter, should you profile your colorimeter when you can mount them close to each other at the same angle, or just one? Which type would be best? I think, Bart, what you might be talking about, I see a lot of people do this, and I really think it's cool, is they'll have on their tripod, they'll have one kind of special mount that holds what is designed for 2 cameras, but you can put 2 meters on that. So let me reread the question one more time and see if I can answer it a little bit better. Should you profile your colorimeter when you can mount them close to each other in the same angle, or just go for one? I mean, I don't know about you, Mike, but I know a lot of calibrators do this as well, but I'm a huge fan. I've got the tools and it doesn't take much time. I'm a huge fan of making a profile every single time, even if it's the same, with a flat panel at least. You might have 2 of the same TVs in the same house that were bought at the same time and their same model number. They're still going to be slightly different from each other. So I'm a big fan of making a profile every single time. I don't know if you would maybe kind of agree with that.
I do profiles once in a while. Sometimes I'm just a chatterbox when I'm with my clients because they want to learn a whole lot from me. So I get a bit lazy and I just use my spectro, and it can take a lot longer and it draws it out. But profiling is perfectly fine. It's a good way to get through a process faster,
Yeah.
as long as you got a really good close match.
Yeah. Charles has a pretty cool question that kind of reverts back to some of the studio stuff, and I see it way more widely used on TVs versus projectors. But everybody wants to have those cool multicolored lights behind their TV that dance around with the video game, and I love that. I think it's a lot of fun. But when we're watching like reference quality video, and it's a movie I'm really looking forward to, I'm a big fan of using a bias light. I've used them for years and years and years. So Charles's question is, how do we feel about D65 bias lighting with a projector screen versus a television? And I think the answer might be it's still going to be the same effect. But the one thing that I'm kind of racking my brain on right now of how you would do that is, the bias light is designed to glow around the screen. So if you're going to put the bias light in properly with the frame, I almost feel like the screen will have to be maybe a few inches off the wall. Have you what's that?
Yeah, I've seen a few installs like that. So some screens have a very like an easy mount bracket they're really thin and the screens are almost flush to the wall. That would be quite challenging in that case. One way around it, of course, is if you want to put a 2x4 on the wall and then mount it to that, and then make sure that the bottom is spaced. I mean, that's the cheap way of doing it. Some other companies have brackets that do pull the projector or the screen out a couple of inches. So yes, I have seen the lighting stripped around. The effect is still the same and it's desirable. I think it's definitely more important it's definitely more important on a smaller screen because the amount of light concentrated in a room is smaller. So having that bias light, it helps your eyes a little bit. So this way the range and contrast isn't so nutty. Plus, if you want to do some other things in the room, it's better to have a light behind the set rather than in front of the set because, as we know, the screens, despite their anti-glare reflectors, you're still going to see that light. So having the light behind is good. On a front projector, that screen is really large, and even at a lower light level, it's still going to cast a whole pile of light in the room. So it takes up more of a viewing space, and it's a little easier to see things you're doing. So it's definitely an added effect, and people do it with multicolors as well. It's just a fun thing. So.
Yeah. I think it's a lot of fun too. I mean, when I'm hanging out, listening to music on the weekends and playing the 2-channel system, I do have a strip of multicolored lights, but I also have a strip on the back of the TV that's D65. And I do want to mention this too. Bias lighting is a super interesting topic to me. And I did a podcast with Jason Rosenfeld from Medialight, who makes some really, really good, high quality, very accurate bias lights. So if you guys want to go back to the Murideo YouTube channel, you'll see that that podcast I did with Jason. Take a look at it, man. It's really interesting stuff because we start getting really down and dirty when it comes to like room lighting and stuff. So feel free to go back and check that out. Okay, Cecil says, what are your thoughts on 203 nits SDR? Stacy Spears, who we know, who makes an awesome test/demo disc. Stacy Spears switched to it for the SDR portion of the new benchmark disc. Light Illusion has a nice write-up and graph showing how it aligns with HDR until the highlights go brighter in HDR. I think maybe Cecil, Mikey may have kind of brushed on that a little bit with getting it to track well to a certain point, and then just everything after that, if you see it, you see it, but if you don't see it, it's just kind of too bad. Cecil,
is this setting 100 nit content to 200 nits, or is this a call for the industry to make diffuse white to 200 to 250 nits? Because those are two different things, and I would agree with the latter. I think we do need to increase our range of SDR to a 250 nit value in the studio. We need to make that shift. I think that's going to happen.
Yeah. But, well, and we have to remember too, guys, that like this whole 100 nit thing that we've always lived and died by was based on the power of a CRT. And when like my OLED at home, when I want 100 nits, the OLED light is at like 10. Yeah. It's crazy low. So we have the capabilities now to make a much brighter picture, but also achieve better contrast than CRTs. So I would have no problem thinking about that. But and Cecil, if that doesn't quite answer the question quite right, just do me a favor and do some follow up there. But 200 nits and SDR, I think that could be pretty fun.
Yeah, and television set, sure, yeah, that's no problem.
Right. Mike says, be careful with off-brand lamps. We talked about that. Ray says, what are you guys seeing in spectral response on the new laser projectors? I don't know about you, Mike, but I'm seeing just really, really, really sharp spikes in blue for the most part when you do a spectral read. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a whole other conversation as well, because even though how we see the light is a little bit different than how we see the lamp light, but let's not, we won't go there today, because that's a different conversation, because of those narrow bands, it's perceived slightly different too. And I think that it's going to require high resolution spectrodiometers in order to measure that correctly.
You know, we looked at these spectral response charts for all these different things, and it's funny because there'll be a big spike in blue on some of these projectors, but then red and green, everything else will be somewhat kind of leveled out and flat. But also, just a side note, I'm seeing a lot of really sharp spikes in the quantum dot stuff too.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, so you got to be careful with the projectors. So, and you know, if you look at the new JVC projectors, which are fantastic, if you measure just D65 as it is, you might notice a little bit of a magenta hue.
Yeah, true.
We'll at
that. And then the last comment / question here from Michael Chen. He says, if you can see that iris moving in real time is distracting. Michael, I totally agree. I think I may have said that before, the pumping effect, if you will. I find it super distracting myself. But again, if I can use the iris maybe at a fixed setting because I've got enough power and I can get better black levels, that might be, it's just one of those things you got to take into consideration when you're there on site. You can see the room. You know, this is why I don't like blanket statements sometimes of like, oh yeah, never use the iris, but it's your judgment call when you're on site to do that kind of stuff or not do it. So guys, that's it for the questions. Thank you so much for hanging in there. We went slightly long, but I think it's a really fun topic and we can go on for hours and hours. If you guys want us to do a part 2 and maybe get a little bit crazier looking at charts and just going a little more down this fun rabbit hole that we tend to live in, just let me know and I'm happy to do a part 2 on this. Mike, I really appreciate the time and I'm glad you were able to make it. And any final words on projectors versus flat panels?
No, and I just want to say, Jason, thank you for inviting me out here, and for everybody who's listening to this webcast or catching it later on, thank you for watching it. I'm hoping that you'll learn something that we have to say. You can catch me on @Video Calibrations on Instagram, or videocalibrations.ca is my website. You can reach out to me if you need to. Yeah, projectors, they're fun, they're more immersive. TVs are great, but I think, as we all know, that cinema feel, it's got to be projection. It's just a different story altogether. So we calibrate for it.
I hear you, and most professionals I talk to would 1,000,000% agree with that. So I love it, man. Okay, cool. Thank you guys for hanging out. And if you have any additional questions, just maybe you can shoot me an email if you'd like. Mine's real easy, jason@murideo.com. And let me know if you want a part 2. If you want a part 2, we're happy to do it. So thanks again, Mike. If you guys just give me a few days and I'll get this put up on YouTube and you can share it around or whatnot. So all right, cool. Thanks. Have a good night.
Have a good night, everybody. Thank you.